There's a type of warfare that military strategists consider the most difficult, more challenging than open desert combat, more complex than mountain operations, more costly in lives than almost any other form of conflict. It's called urban warfare, fighting in cities. And in the 21st century, it has become the dominant form of armed conflict worldwide. Today, we're going to explore something that most people never think about: how the design of cities determines who lives and who dies when war arrives. How architects and urban planners, without intending to, create the battlefields of tomorrow. And how militaries around the world are studying urban design not to build better cities, but to destroy them more efficiently. This is not a comfortable topic, but understanding it might be one of the most important things we can do. Cities were not designed for war. They were designed for living, for commerce, for community. The narrow streets of old cities exist because people walked. The dense housing exists because land was scarce. The markets and squares exist because people needed places to gather. But these same features that make cities livable also make them defensible. A narrow street is hard for an army to advance through. A dense neighborhood provides endless hiding places. A market square can become a killing ground for anyone trying to cross it. Throughout history, defenders have understood this instinctively. When armies approached, cities closed their gates. Residents barricaded streets. Buildings became fortresses. The same walls that kept out winter wind could stop bullets. Attackers learned that taking cities was expensive. Siege warfare could last months or years. Street by street fighting consumed soldiers at horrifying rates. Many commanders simply avoided urban combat entirely, preferring to starve cities into submission rather than fight through them. Modern warfare changed this calculation. Artillery could reduce buildings to rubble. Aircraft could bomb from above. The walls that had protected cities for millennia became irrelevant against industrial weapons. But something unexpected happened. Even as cities became more vulnerable to destruction, they became more important strategically. More people lived in cities. More economic activity happened in cities. More political power was concentrated in cities. You couldn't win a modern war without controlling urban areas. This created a terrible dilemma. Cities were both essential to capture and devastating to fight in. The result has been some of the most destructive battles in human history. Stalingrad, Manila, Kiev, Grozny, Mosul, Aleppo. The list goes on. Each of these battles taught military planners lessons, and those lessons have been compiled into doctrine. Strategies for attacking cities, strategies for defending them, and increasingly, strategies for designing cities with future conflict in mind. Let me explain how urban geography shapes combat. First, consider density. The more buildings per square kilometer, the more places for defenders to hide. The more walls that need to be breached, the more rooms that need to be cleared. High-density cities heavily favor defenders. Every block becomes a potential fortress. Second, consider street layout. Regular grids allow attackers to establish clear lines of advance. They can predict where they're going. They can coordinate movements. Irregular layouts, like medieval street patterns, create confusion. Attackers get lost. Units lose contact with each other. Ambushes become easier. Third, consider building construction. Concrete and steel structures can withstand significant firepower. They provide cover. They channel movement. Wooden buildings burn. They offer less protection, but they also create less rubble to block streets. Fourth, consider infrastructure. Underground systems like subways, sewers, and utility tunnels provide movement routes invisible from above. Defenders who know these systems have enormous advantages. Attackers have to fight in 3 dimensions above ground, at ground level, and below. Fifth, consider civilian presence. This might be the most important factor of all. Cities contain civilians, lots of them, and what happens to those civilians shapes the entire nature of urban combat. A military that doesn't care about civilian casualties can use overwhelming firepower, flatten buildings, destroy whole blocks, accept that thousands of innocents will die. This is faster and costs fewer military lives. It's also a war crime under international law and creates lasting resentment that can fuel decades of future conflict. A military that tries to protect civilians faces agonizing constraints. They can't use heavy weapons freely. They have to clear buildings room by room. They have to distinguish combatants from innocents in seconds. Every tactical decision carries moral weight. This is why urban warfare is so controversial and so devastating. The design of cities puts civilians directly in the line of fire. There's no way to fight in a city without affecting the people who live there. Now, I want to talk about something that might seem abstract, but has very real consequences. Military influence on urban planning. Armies have always shaped cities. Fortification walls, garrison towns, military roads. But in the 21st century, this influence has become more subtle and more pervasive. Some countries now consult with military planners when designing new urban areas. They consider sightlines, chokepoints, defensible positions. They think about how a neighborhood might be controlled in a future conflict. Other countries take the opposite approach. They deliberately design cities to be difficult to control. Dense warrens that would swallow an occupying army. Communities that can seal themselves off. Urban fabric that favors the defender. Both approaches have costs. Cities designed for military control tend to be less pleasant to live in. Wide boulevards that offer clear firing lines also create windswept in human spaces. Cities designed for resistance tend to be dense and confusing, which creates other problems. The Gaza Strip represents an extreme case of how urban design and conflict interact. It's one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Over 2 million people live in an area about the size of a medium city. Buildings are packed tight. Streets are narrow. The urban fabric has been shaped by decades of conflict. The tunnel networks beneath Gaza have become famous. Hundreds of kilometers of underground passages. Some for smuggling. Some for military purposes. Some for moving between buildings without exposure to aerial surveillance. These tunnels represent an adaptation to a specific military reality. When you can't control the surface, go underground. The buildings themselves have been modified by conflict. Fighting positions built into residential structures. Weapons stored in basements. Command centers in buildings that look like everything around them. The line between civilian and military infrastructure has blurred beyond recognition. This creates impossible situations for everyone involved. For attackers trying to target military assets without destroying civilian homes. For defenders whose military strategy depends on that blurring. For civilians caught between forces they can't control. I want to be clear that I'm not taking sides in any specific conflict. What I'm describing is a pattern that repeats worldwide. From Syria to Ukraine to Myanmar, cities become battlefields. Urban design becomes military strategy. Civilians pay the price. The future of warfare is urban. Military analysts are nearly unanimous on this point. As the world's population concentrates in cities, conflicts will increasingly be fought in cities. The question is not whether this will happen, but how to limit the damage when it does. Some propose architectural solutions. Buildings designed to be more resistant to weapons. Urban layouts that allow civilians to evacuate more easily. Infrastructure that can continue functioning during conflict. Others propose legal solutions. Stricter enforcement of international humanitarian law. Better mechanisms for holding militaries accountable for civilian deaths. Clearer rules about what tactics are acceptable in urban environments. Still others propose political solutions. Addressing the underlying conflicts that lead to urban warfare. Reducing the conditions that make cities into battlegrounds in the first place. None of these solutions are easy, and none of them fully address the fundamental problem. Cities are where people live. Wars are fought where people live. As long as both of these things are true, urban warfare will continue to kill civilians. What we can do is understand. Understand that the design of cities is not neutral. That the streets we walk down and the buildings we live in would become tactical terrain in a conflict. That the choices made by planners and architects decades ago will shape how future battles unfold. This knowledge doesn't prevent war. but it might help us design cities that are more resilient, that offer better protection to civilians, that don't become death traps when conflict arrives. Every city is a potential battlefield. The question is whether we design them with that reality in mind, not to make war easier, but to make its human cost lower. This has been a difficult topic, but difficult topics are often the most important ones to understand. The relationship between urban design and warfare shapes millions of lives. It deserves our attention, even when that attention is uncomfortable. If you want to continue exploring how design shapes our world in ways we rarely consider, stick around. I'll see you in the next one.